In this video in the STOic TTX Facilitator training, we're going to go over the participant engagement skill of maintaining momentum. This is a skill that is common for any type of facilitating of group discussions. And what I'm going to cover today is a really high-level view of some of these basic skills. And if you want to learn more, there are lots of online resources for ideas on how to facilitate group discussions. But we want to cover it anyway here in the training so that you have something to work with if you've never had to do this before. So when you are trying to facilitate open discussions within a group, you need to be able to ask very open-ended questions. If you ask questions that are answered with a yes or no too often, sometimes as a facilitator in a tabletop exercise, you end up needing to ask some yes or no questions, either as for confirmation or as curiosity questions. And sometimes the answer is just simply very pointedly yes or no, and that's okay. But to keep momentum going, you need to ask open-ended questions. These are questions for which there is not a single answer or a single word answer. One of the most basic of these questions is very simple prompt saying, "Can you tell me more?" It allows open discussion and it puts the focus on the participants to be able to keep saying more. One of the things I like to do when the discussions have exhausted themselves in a certain tangent, they have gone down a side alley of thought, and they reach the end, and there's really nothing more to say. Or they have a process that they are going through or they're trying to think of on the spot, and they reach sort of a natural conclusion there. As a facilitator, to bring things back and to move things forward, you could introduce a new inject. That's perfectly fine. Or you can ask some more open-ended questions about more generally the scenario. So one of the things I love to ask is, what worries you at this point? And that helps move people out of whatever specific thing they were chasing down or trying to understand, and there's nothing left to say. And it brings it back to the center in a completely open-ended way. And you'll have all kinds of participants being able to jump in to say, well, I'm really worried about this, or I'm really worried about that, or we should be looking into this or looking into that. And the discussion starts popping up again, and that's exactly what you want. You can also get the participants to start imagining things completely in parallel to the scenario and to their processes. For instance, if there was one thing that you could have in this incident right now, what would it be, right? Completely open-ended, open imagination, free-form discussion type of a thing. And it might not help progress the scenario, but it brings in more imagination, and you might be able to get some things that you can record and put in your report as, hey, these are things that the participants, the responders, say that they would like. Maybe the organization should consider getting it to them. And so that's another great thing to put in, and it helps kickstart the imagination and kickstart the discussions. The Facilitator's Guide for STOic TTX has some of these open questions that can be very, very useful in a scenario. One of the things you can do with these open-ended questions is to ask them directly of certain participants. This is really, really useful when you have very quiet participants. They might be quiet for all kinds of reasons. They might have social anxiety, and being put on the spot is not going to be something that they want. So never push the quiet people. You want to invite them to have an opportunity to contribute equally as much as everybody else. Whether they are just naturally quiet people, they're introverts, they have social anxiety, or they feel like they don't have a place, that the rest of the participants are senior to them or more experienced. Maybe they've just been on the job for a couple months. We had a tabletop exercise where that was true. In one of the pilots, where I've only been here for 2 months, I don't know anything. By asking some of these open-ended questions that aren't necessarily specific about the threat or the scenario or the process, but some of these blue sky type of a question can help let some of these more quiet people feel like they also have something to contribute as well. There are two specific points when you want to stop your thread of discussion and stop your intended thread of questions and ask more open-ended blue sky questions, and it becomes really, really important. These 2 points are when people look shocked or when people get a little too confidently dismissive about their own process or about a curiosity question that you've asked. If you're doing a scenario and you've just provided an inject, or you've suggested a curiosity question of, what happens if it was the developer's machine that got affected, and everybody's eyebrows shoot up to the ceiling and everyone looks like a deer in headlights, you need to stop what you're doing and take a step back and allow the group to explore their shock in that scenario. Because if they are that shocked, and this happens with organizations with an immature incident response program, they get really, really shocked at what could potentially go wrong. And you want to start asking why. Why are you shocked? Why does this cause you particular fear? Why is this more of a concern than what we were dealing with? And you want to get that on the table, because what it means is they knew, likely at some level, they knew that this was a particular threat and a particular risk to the organization, but they didn't want to deal with it. Don't talk about it. Don't mention it. They didn't want to think about it. Let's just leave that door shut. And you've just ripped open the door and let the sunlight in. And you want to very carefully and slowly let them explore that and come to terms with that and get really specific about what the threats are and how they might handle that. And that might be, and we've had this happen in a couple tabletop scenarios with a couple different organizations, that was basically the end of the scenario. The rest of the time was all about talking about the potentialities of that thing happening and what the consequences would be and how they would have to handle it. And that was it. And it became an exceedingly valuable exercise, if nothing else, so they had to deal with this one thing that they knew at some level they needed to deal with, but simply weren't. The other time you need to stop and start asking some of these really open-ended questions is when the participants get really confidently dismissive about a threat, a risk, a resource, or a response. The reason why is that it is usually an indication that they have overconfidence in their abilities or their resources to handle the situation. And they probably are taking things for granted and they're overlooking some things. This is particularly a case when people are relying on third parties or technology. We had ransomware. We have ransomware on these machines, but the antivirus will catch it, and that's the end of the discussion, right? That's it. They just antivirus stops ransomware. Full stop. Done. Next question, please. And at this point, you as a facilitator need to back up, stop, and explore the reasons for their dismissiveness. They might have the world's most advanced antivirus that catches every single ransomware variant known to mankind. That'd be good to know too, but they probably don't. And so you want to understand why they feel so confident and so dismissive that whatever you've raised, whatever inject or whatever detail that you've proposed, whatever curiosity question that you've raised, simply isn't a concern and isn't a risk. You want to explore that. Pulling back, asking really open-ended questions and exploring this is really, really important, because it's likely an indication that they have massive gaps that they have not even considered. Equally to a really dismissive attitude is a really vague attitude. We just handle it. And I've had a participant say that. There's ransomware breaking out, we just handle that. Great, that's fantastic. I'm so glad you're handling that. How? Why? What types of steps would you take? You really need to pull back and take things at a really high level and walk them through their own process and get them to think about some of these things. That's not really common, certainly not if they are bringing in a tabletop exercise facilitator or wanting to do tabletop exercises. The participants usually have a little bit more engagement than that. But if you've got people who are not really digging into some of these details, you need to help them and guide them through that process. And not only can completely open-ended questions help with that, but you also want to use the other questions that we've also mentioned in this series, which are the confirmation questions, the curiosity questions, and the consequence questions, to help walk them through their own thinking of their own responses. In the Facilitator training guide, we have a bit of a cheat sheet of a pool of questions that the facilitator can have on hand as inspiration during an exercise to look towards, so that you have questions to ask in case you run into weird scenarios, you run into weird responses, or you need something desperately to keep the conversation from dying an awkward death. Make sure that they are available and handy for you in the middle of an exercise.